just do the responsible thing and abort a fetus, which arguably isn't even really a living thing. It's not sentient. So, fuck.
I'm personally unsure about the moral problem of abortion, but I'll represent several reasons for why I think Vegan Gain's arguments are flawed, and I want to show improved versions of how an argument could be made for abortion. As far as I can tell, he offers 5 different arguments for the moral permissibility of abortion. The order in which I present them is not necessarily reflective of how they were presented in his 3.5-hour stream. The first argument relies on the lack of sentience in fetuses under a certain age. Here one could object by saying they are already born human beings who lack sentience and who we would deem worthy of human rights. Take for example a 10-year-old initially unplanned child that for whatever reason could not be aborted while his mother was pregnant with it. After its birth, it turns out he has a rare neurological condition that prevents him from having any kind of sentience. He is however not in a vegetable state because he is what we would call a quote-unquote philosophical zombie, meaning that he is outwardly indistinguishable from a sentient human being. He is just as intelligent and just as social as a sentient human. Now, after 10 years, doctors announce a cure has been found for his disease, but unfortunately it takes exactly 9 months to manufacture it, and he would gain sentience at the same speed as a newborn. Would it be okay to passively kill this human by depriving him of parental services like food providing and shelter? After the announcement of his cure has been made? I don't think it would be. Another point you could make is to question the moral significance of the levels of sentience a fetus has, or even a small newborn. Is it really worse to cause some amount of pain to a probably rather primitively sentient being for a fraction of a second to kill it than to destroy biologically wholly present potential of a human being? Let's suppose, and I know this is not how it actually works neurologically, but we have a fetus who snaps into being sentient from 1 millisecond to another. Would its moral significance change drastically after it was just as disposable as an inanimate object less than a heartbeat ago? Sure, if you want to argue for abortion, you will have to draw a line at some point, and that point will ultimately be arbitrary. But I don't see how a couple of days or even weeks or even a couple of months of primitive sentience are morally relevant, unless you're talking about torture. The fact that the moral value of something should change drastically based on the pretty much inevitable development that it will go through within a couple of weeks anyway seems absurd. If I ask myself why sentience is important, I inevitably end up thinking about stuff that does not only require sentience, but also a prolonged time during which I had said sentience. For example, I think about all the things you have been investing in, all the relationships, all the hobbies, your career or your health. I don't really know how to explain the moral value of sentience, again, unless we're talking about torture, without that sentience having been present for at least some time.
Brother had severe kidney disease, okay? And you chose to help your brother out who couldn't get dialysis, so some like crazy doctor hooked up his circulatory system to yours, and 9 months, so in 9 months, basically the problem that your brother has with his kidney disease, it'd be treated, and then you'd both be able to live just fine. Okay, well, let's say within that 9-month period, you couldn't work because you're connected to this other person's circulatory system, and you were going to end up losing your house, and you had a family that depended on you. Maybe you have other wife and kids and everything, and you had to make the decision, you know what, my family, my wife, kids, supporting them, keeping our house, that matters more than my brother's life. So I decided to just disconnect the, I guess the veins, the arteries, the circulatory system connecting me and my brother. is that murder?
Here Vegan Gains lays out his version of Judith Jarvis Thomson's analogy of a person voluntarily agreeing to giving dialysis to his brother with kidney disease. In his scenario, the healthy person would lose his house, his wife, and kids that live in that house if he keeps being hooked to his brother, because he can't work during the 9 months procedure. This example makes me wonder if Vegan Gains thinks abortion is only okay if outweighed by being able to avoid these extreme consequences. What if a woman just doesn't want the baby, even if she has enough money, a healthy relationship, good access to medical care, education, free time activities, everything else a kid could wish for? Does he think abortion is wrong then? If not, I don't see why he does not focus more on this case, which is the most difficult to argue for and from which the legitimacy of every less consequence-heavy abortion scenario would follow anyway. It becomes more of a trolley problem at that point, at which you argue if a life can be morally sacrificed to save the life of multiple other lives, even when in this case it's not literal life-saving, but at least decent quality of life-saving of multiple people. But even when looking at the scenario he chose, the problem is I'm not the one who brought another human being into the situation of its life being dependent on another person's physical sacrifice. What if my brother and I played American football together and I unintentionally tackle him in a way that damages his kidneys, causing him to be dependent on someone giving him dialysis? Would I now not be morally obligated to give him dialysis for 9 months to save his life, even if I lose my house in the process? I think he would be. And I think this is much more analogous to pregnancy, because the woman proactively takes the risk to cause the fetus to have its life be dependent on the mother's bodily sacrifice. Just as the football player risks to injure someone whenever he participates in the game. If you think football is riskier, you can pick a different sport that's less intense but still carries somewhat of a risk, which is virtually every physical team sport. Take another example. What if I build a basement next to my house in which I regularly invite friends over to party? Suppose the fun and bonding I experience while partying there with my friends is about as good for my life as an actual active sexual life, and it's the only possibility to party because everywhere else your neighbors would complain. Now suppose, as an architect, I know that the materials I had to choose for the ceiling have a really small chance of breaking every time we party down there. And I also know sometimes people stand on the ground under which my basement is built. What if one night the ceiling breaks and a person who unknowingly stood on the wrong spot falls down there, breaking his legs? Would it be morally permissible for me to kick him out, leaving him to die? Or would I be morally obligated, in the absence of any kind of medical emergency services, to care for him for 9 months until he can leave standing on his own 2 feet again? I think these examples are more analogous to pregnancy. Also, what about an unwanted child who could not get aborted for some reason and who is now 10 years old? If sentience does not matter, like it does not in these examples, why can't I restore my autonomy by letting my child die, who is not self-reliant yet? Another final thought experiment would be the closest to a real-life example as we could get. What if you have conjoined twins and only one has healthy kidneys, keeping the other one alive? Here we have 2 attached human beings who have just as much autonomy as we have, and why should we judge the accident of tissue fusion in the womb as morally different as the initially voluntary attachment to your brother? Should the healthy twin be allowed to let his unhealthy twin die?
No one has any moral responsibility to take care of an elderly person.
Vegan Gains also makes an addition as the third argument to Judith Thomson's analogy. He says you don't have a moral duty to care for elderly people or people on life support. I think I've adequately answered this objection by pointing out how people actively take the risk of bringing people into situations of physical dependency.
Can't, express in some way that it wants to live, then it doesn't matter if you destroy it, if you kill it, if you murder.
Another argument is his claim that if you can't express your will to live, you can't be granted a right to life. This argument fails, I think, because attributing a will to live is usually the default interpretation if you take a look at a being who is not actively trying to harm themselves. If you have an animal that's acclimated to human beings, so it does not flee even when weird stuff happens to it, let's also say it has congenital insensitivity to pain, so it does not run away after being harmed. How could we access this being's will to live? Maybe it's even some kind of reptile that does not have to eat or drink for extended periods of time, yet we would still take its will to live as the default interpretation of its behavior.
I want to point out two things now. So, one, I want to reiterate my argument. Okay, so just because somebody might have made a bad decision, or maybe the circumstances of their decision changed, so maybe somebody deliberately wanted to have a child, and something bad happened, like their spouse died, and now they're not financially able to take care of a child, or maybe somebody was just being completely irresponsible, and they just had unprotected sex, and were completely just unprepared to have a child. Okay, well, in either of those circumstances, why the hell should we punish people for either making a bad decision or just from just unfortunate circumstances happening to them? Why should they be punished? Because these are potential negative outcomes to having sex and procreating. Again, you could make the same argument for sexually transmitted diseases. Oh, you got HIV, oh, you got syphilis, well, you should have known that could have happened to you, so we're not going to give you treatment for any of those things because, you knew the risks.
Vegan Gains is also committing a begging the question fallacy. In another argument, he equates a refusal to provide an abortion with punishment, which presumes we have already answered whether abortion is morally right or not. Otherwise, refusing to provide an abortion on the grounds of morality is not a punishment. Punishment is meant to make the punished suffer, which is clearly not the goal of refusing an abortion. His analogy also fails, because if the treatment for an STD required something as immoral as killing a full human being, which is what the pro-life person sees it as, you would also reconsider your opinion about it. He also equates abortion with care, which also begs the question in the same way as the pro-life person could provide other kinds of care, could be willing to provide other kinds of care that don't involve an abortion, like counseling, welfare, and government-issued household helpers or something like that.
That the right to protect yourself, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to do what you want, supersedes life itself, then I don't understand how you could say abortion is wrong because it ends up killing an unborn child. That sounds like a completely contradictory statement to me. So, yeah, if you were pro-life and you were presented with evidence that gun ownership or availability of, legal availability of guns increases gun deaths, and this is a direct causal relationship, but you'd still be in favor of, legalizing firearms, that would seem to be a contradictory belief to the idea that it's wrong to abort children because it results in death, because you're in favor of bodily autonomy in one instance, even though there's evidence it ends up killing people, but you're against bodily autonomy in another instance, even though, it still kills people all the same.
Another mistake I think he makes is not directly related to an argument for abortion, and more aimed at pointing out an alleged point of hypocrisy, people who simultaneously support gun rights and the so-called pro-life position. I think this argument is based on the mistaken belief that pro-life means you are necessarily supporting everything that saves the most lives. I think it merely means you don't want to declare any human life is not worthy of living. And the pro-life people see any human life, any fetus from the point of conception as human life. Just because you accept the death toll that gun rights might bring upon us does not mean you declare those lost lives unworthy of living.
The children who are never born, because their parents just didn't have sex, they didn't reproduce, are they upset that they were never born? No, of course not.
Another mistake I think he makes is not directly related to an argument for abortion and more aimed at pointing out an alleged point of hypocrisy, people who simultaneously support gun rights and the so-called pro-life position. I think this argument is based on the mistaken belief that pro-life means you are necessarily supporting everything that saves the most lives. I think it merely means you don't want to declare any human life is not worthy of living, and the pro-life people see any human life, any fetus from the point of conception as human life. Just because you accept the death toll that gun rights might bring upon us does not mean you declare those lost lives unworthy of living. The last argument is the argument from potential taken to absurdity. Vegan Games claims that if you declare a potential to become an adult human as the reason for why we should not abort fetuses, you could equally say that you are just as guilty of depriving a person's potential to grow up if you choose to remain childless. That seems patently absurd, and therefore mere potential can't be seen as morally relevant on its own. I think this argument is the most promising one, but I don't think Vegan Gains fleshes it out sufficiently. Often he asks, are the children that were never born upset that they were never born? Which is irrelevant, as nobody could be upset after being killed, even if they just begged you to let them live 1 second ago. Even if you pointed out how they clearly expressed they wanted to live. They are still not upset. They still can't suffer in any way from being deprived of everything they worked for in their life. They can't regret what they will miss out on in the future. But all of that would not cause us to deem their killing just fine. Also, not every sentient being clearly expresses their will to live. A being could have no friends that have any knowledge about what's going on in their mind. Just taking in food and other life-sustaining measures don't necessarily constitute a will to live. You could still be afraid of starvation. You could still be afraid of ending it yourself and secretly long for a random exterior circumstance to peacefully end it for you. We can definitely imagine a scenario in which it's totally unclear if a previously conscious person wants to wake up from a coma or not. We could even imagine a scenario in which neurologists look into his brain and determine the person has literally never thought about whether he wants to live or not. He could have never contemplated the quality of his life. He could even imagine extracting the very thought from his mind that if he fell into a coma, he would not know whether he wanted to wake up or not. He could have no opinion on that topic, and yet we would still err on the side of reviving him. And if you now objected that at least he has the neurological capacity to contemplate such a question, we could imagine him lacking a part of his brain, disabling his brain from even conceptually understanding what it means to contemplate the question of whether you want to live or not. Yet still, we would err on the side of waking him up again. Another possible source of confusion that I'm not fully sure about is the possibly morally relevant distinction between possible and potential people, or in other words, a distinction between two kinds of potential. Let's say you have an apple. That apple has in some sense the potential to save a life, but it probably won't happen if you just leave the apple lying on a table in your garden. But what if a person who's about to dehydrate crawls onto your lawn and with his last bits of energy tries to take the apple to hydrate himself sufficiently until you can call an ambulance? These are two kinds of potential. In the first case, there's just the mere possibility of that apple to save a life. And in the other example, you just have to let the organically upcoming events unfold for the apple to save a life. A simple apple does not have moral value, so you can do with it whatever you want, even if you could save someone's life, theoretically. But the apple that is visibly about to save someone's life does have moral value in a sense. You could try and make this into an analogy to abortion, in which sperm just has the mere possibility to contribute to your life, while an already conceived fetus just has to organically unfold to realize its potential to become a grown human being. Now there is the question though, that if it just takes a partner to bring the apple into the position of its life-saving potential being organically unfolded, is that morally obligatory, or does it go beyond the baseline? I'm not sure about this question just yet, but I think it sounds like a pretty good case that the moral difference between potential and possible people is small enough to still mandate procreation for someone who defends the argument from potential, at least for people who have partners. Let's flesh this out a little bit more. If you are a decrepit, lonely, and completely isolated 50-year-old man, you still have 10 years of intense personal development and therapy to go through, to begin to be able to approach a woman which also has to be considerably younger than you are. You are probably not morally obligated to procreate. But what if the only thing you have to change in your daily routine is to remove a less than paper-thin poisonous layer of plastic from the apple, so some dehydrating person could actually eat it and the apple unfolds its life-saving potential? Would you be morally obligated to do it? I think that might be a good analogy to how removing contraceptives would still fall within the moral baseline if you're using the argument from potential. An argument that I would prefer to use though, to try to make a person realize that what they really care about is the definitely attackable argument from potential, is the following. Let's say we have a fetus that for some biological reason cannot progress beyond its very early stages of development. Let's say it will stay a 1 second old fetus as long as it lives, which will be a totally normal human lifespan of 80 years. Would it be okay to kill it? Now we just have to draw the line to decide at what point it is still okay to perform an abortion. As I said earlier, mere sentience does not suffice in my eyes as a distinguishing factor. Let's assume someone only has primitive, fetus-like sentience every time he cuts his toenails, so only a couple of times a month for a couple of minutes. But we could also suppose that he is continuously cutting his toenails, which is absurd, but let's suppose he does. Would he have moral value? It's hard to say, but I think my point is clear. What you experience while being sentient is morally relevant when deciding how valuable that sentience is. Is what a fetus experiences really more morally important than cutting your toenails? He doesn't really seem to do any of the things that give sentience its value, like investing in hobbies, your own personal philosophy, relationships, your career, health, and all sorts of things that could make a person enjoy his life, even if it's just playing video games. Some concept of investment into anything. If you only felt unending suffering, sentience would not really be that valuable. If you only felt what's going through your mind and body while cutting toes, with the sentience level of a fetus, and let's suppose you are continuously thinking about the very boring and monotone act of cutting your toenails, because theoretically you could contemplate anything you want while cutting your toenails, but let's suppose that's the only content of your mind at that point. Would you really be having an experience that would give moral value to your sentience? The point is, I don't think the experiences a fetus probably has are morally relevant enough to give moral value to its sentience. Maybe, Just maybe you could attempt to argue the relationship the fetus is building with his mother while in the womb gives somewhat of a moral value to its sentience. I'm not sure about that, but at the end of the day, I'm pro-choice legally speaking, even though I'm confused about the morality, but I'm just an internet amateur anyway, and criminalizing it might not even decrease its prevalence, but definitely increases its dangerousness for the women.